Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight on this special gathering and lecture. We are very privileged to have with us Rabbi Zippel from Salt Lake City, Utah. I have to say that I haven't prepared kind of the same formal intro for this speaker as I did for others, not because he's any less distinguished, God forbid, on the contrary. I just feel that it's almost a little Hamish over here for two reasons. First of all, Rabbi Zippel has a special Toronto connection. Many of you are probably familiar with his very famous grandfather, Rabbi Emanuel Shochet of blessed memory. So Rabbi Zippel's mother is Rabbi Shochet's daughter. I think I got that right. And we are even privileged that Rebbetzin Yeti Shochet, who is Rabbi Zippel's grandmother, I think is online listening to this lecture and joining us as well. So that's one special connection. In addition, Rabbi Zippel and I go way back. I was his counselor in camp, and I do remember Rabbi Zippel as little Avremi, but the truth is he was never little. He was always a very articulate, outspoken, never shy person, bursting with confidence and eloquence. So it's almost like natural to have him as a speaker. And what can I say? I'm excited. It's a difficult subject that we're going to be addressing tonight. But it feels nice and Hamish and warm to be with all of you together and to have Rabbi Zippel with us. So this would feel like a good time to unmute Rabbi Zippel, and perhaps can you hear us?
I think we're good. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very clearly. Okay. Thank you for joining us, Rabbi Zippel. Thank you for joining us. All of you? No, there shouldn't be. You shouldn't need a password to come on. You want to sit down here? Okay. Here. So the way that Rabbi Zippel requested that we do this would be in interview format. So I have some questions over here, and let's get this started. So Rabbi Zippel, you grew up in Salt Lake City after the Rebbe of blessed memory sent your parents to Utah to serve there as the Chabad rabbi and rebbetzin. Tell us about your parents' work and what it was like for you as a child growing up in the home of parents who were the Chabad reps, not to Brooklyn, not to Toronto, but to Salt Lake City, Utah.
Well, first of all, Rabbi Steiner, Rebbetzin Steiner, other Rabbi Steiner, thank you very much for having me tonight. It's a great honor. I think the other Rabbi Steiner was also my counselor in the same camp a few years after his brother. Also, I do feel
I thought I was the only Rabbi Steiner.
No, I think your brother had me 4 years later, actually, if memory serves, in Arizona. I feel all this talk about being from Salt Lake City is a little awkward in present company. I actually took the pain of Googling it today. Although in a situation like this, Uptown Chabad extends itself throughout the whole world, I was born approximately 6.7 miles away from the brick and mortar Uptown Chabad, at least according to Google Maps, in a hospital that no longer stands, called Northwestern General of blessed memory. And so I feel that specifically amongst present company, I can also be from Toronto, as was always said in our house, especially after Canada Day. I certainly feel a pull towards my motherland. But anyways, to answer the question, as Rabbi Moshe Steiner said, my parents were sent to Salt Lake City 28 years ago this month, in the summer of 1992. My father was actually, he merited to receive a bracha from the Rebbe to check out if Utah was the right place, had the right stuff for a shliach. The last night that the Rebbe gave out dollars in March of 1992, and they brought me along for the ride. I was just under a year when they moved out here. The first Chabad event that ever took place in Salt Lake City was my first birthday party, and I grew up on the job. I'm the oldest of six, as is very common in the household of a shliach and a shlucha of a Chabad rabbi and rebbetzin. They bring their work home with them. And so we were raised in a very, shlichus-centered atmosphere. It was always something which we were familiar with growing up. And from a very, very young age, it was always a dream of mine to one day be able to live this life on my own. And I was very fortunate after going to yeshiva and finishing my education, or getting a large part of my education and never really finishes, and getting married. Almost 6 years ago, in December of 2014, my wife and I were fortunate to move out here and join the team of shluchim here in Utah, and to indeed fulfill that childhood fantasy. And it's been my life for as far back as I can remember it. It's been something which has always been something which I was proud of and felt fortunate to have as part of my identity. And I'm thankful to still have that till today. So it's definitely something which we are thankful and fortunate and grateful for.
Awesome. This is not planned, but as you're talking about what you're talking about, I see a picture on the wall behind you. Is there a possibility that you can take that picture and put it closer to the camera? Because I think it fits right into what you're talking about.
So it's actually, that one is completely stuck to the wall. It took quite some time to get it up. I have to see if I can find
So
it.
if you look, so move your head to the side just for a second.
Right, there we go.
Other way. So, and that I think is tell us about the picture.
So that picture was actually taken. There's numerous versions of the story, but the accurate version is that picture was taken in December of 1991. It's become one of the more iconic images of the Rebbe's later years. My father and mother were going to Italy to celebrate Hanukkah, and as was very common, my father, before he left Crown Heights, before he left the Rebbe's backyard, would go and ask for a bracha for any trip that he was taking. And so shortly before Hanukkah, he took me to 770 together with him to receive.
So you're the little baby in the white jumper there?
I'm the little baby. In fact, the picture might be stuck, but let's see if we could do it this way. So that is me in the white snowsuit. And this was actually, I had heard from Rabbi Groner years later that in this exchange, the Rebbe was very particular to have my hand opened. And the Rebbe never sufficed with just giving something to one's parent on their behalf. The Rebbe saw children as a very integral part of life, and they have a very specific mission. And the Rebbe actually made sure that my hand was open to the best of my 4-month-old ability to receive the nickel for tzedakah, and it's one that we still have at home today, and it's something which it's a tremendous bracha, and it's a picture which obviously I'm very fond of.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you for sharing that. Now, obviously, your childhood was not a simple one. Like I said, I remember you as a camper in my bunk, just being full of confidence, a super outspoken, wonderful boy, but clearly it was not a simple childhood that you experienced. Can you tell us a little bit about the events that led you to where you are today?
Sure. So when I was growing up, there was not back then, and actually still not till today, there is no formal infrastructure for Jewish education here in Salt Lake City. And so that meant that as a child, I was homeschooled together with my siblings. Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, Chabad is very technologically advanced, and being homeschooled means online school and virtual school, and you have classmates and teachers and so on and so on. But back in my day, it was real old-fashioned homeschool. We were in the home all day studying with our parents. In the era of COVID, when people will complain to me how difficult it is to be home with their kids a whole day, I'll tell them that that's one area where I'm not able to afford a lot of sympathy, as that was my childhood. We were home all day, every day. It was the life we knew. And that was it. We studied at home with my mother and father, and we lived the Chabad life. In the summer of 1998, my mother was expecting my little brother, who's number 5 in the family, and my parents decided that it might be a good idea to get some full-time help, to have an extra pair of hands around the house. And so that summer, my parents hired a nanny, a babysitter. She came very highly recommended from the community, and she began to work with our family that summer. And about a year later, shortly after my 8th birthday, she began to sexually abuse me. And that would ultimately continue for just almost exactly 10 years. It concluded in 2009. At that point, most of us at home had grown up, and most of us were studying outside the home, and there wasn't that need for a full-time presence inside the house. And so my parents let her go, but it had gone on for 10 years at that point. And it would remain a secret, and a secret that I would expend a lot of energy to make sure it stayed secret for it would continue for a number of years, up until 2016. And in 2016, I had just become a father myself. And at that point, I feel like a lot of the issues that I had been working very, very hard to bury for a number of years ultimately just bubbled up to the fore and spilled over. And it was imperative that I get some mental health help at the urging of my parents and my wife, and I did. And I began to tackle the issues that had been laying in my past. And Baruch Hashem, I'm tremendously grateful and fortunate that I'm now in a place where I can speak about it. But it definitely brought with it, and still even till today brings with it, a significant amount of baggage.
Last year, you pressed charges against the nanny for what she did. I know this is a very painful subject for you to talk about, but can you share with us how you decided to pursue justice and the challenges you experienced during the process?
So the justice system is an experience of its own, and it comes with its own set of circumstances, if you will. I think what really laid at the heart of the issue was, initially when I had gone to the police, I called the police in the winter of 2018. I had been in therapy for about 2 years at that point, and I reported the crime, not really sure if anything would come of it. At that point, the crime had been committed almost 20 years beforehand, and I was fully expecting it to be filed away.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to get a sense of the timeline.
Sure.
The abuse started when you were 8 years old?
1999.
When you were 8, and then it lasted for about 10 years until you were 18.
Until 2009, yeah.
Okay.
And I was going to the police 9 years later, so almost 20 years after it had begun, essentially.
After it had begun. So,
Right.
but from when it ended until you were in the position to report it, that lasted for
about 7 till I went to see a therapist was about 7 years, and then in therapy, slowly, the notion and the possibility of reporting it and what would come with that, was something we had talked about for quite some time. And ultimately, I took the plunge in the early winter of 2018.
At which point you were about 25 years old.
I was 25 years old. Yeah. 26 years
Sorry
old.
for the interruption, please.
No, it's that's important. When I had called the police, I personally had never thought that anything would come of it. This is a crime that was committed decades ago. But to me, what was most important was that I stay anonymous throughout this process. And I remember in my first interview with a detective from the Salt Lake City Police Department, I told him in so many words, I said, I don't want to be Zippel, the guy who was sexually abused. I have a life of my own. Thank God I'm a rabbi. I live in Salt Lake City. Enough people stare at me when I walk in the streets. My life is unusual enough as it is. I'd prefer if we could go through this anonymously. And he made it clear to me that, they would do the best they could to protect my anonymity. But at some point, it is out of their hands. Ultimately, the evidence that was needed to pursue this was, they came up with it, and it was, charges were filed and it was going to go to trial. And it came to a point where I was going to have to make the decision to come forward. I was going to have to testify in open court. And, I didn't have that guarantee of anonymity that could protect me anymore. And that was something which was tremendously scary and overwhelming. I did not know of anyone who was a public male survivor of sexual abuse within the Frum community, certainly not within the Chabad community. And it was a challenging time. It was a time where I had to decide if this was something which I was going to be comfortable with being my identity. I remember one night before, in the weeks leading up to this decision, I decided that, there had to be someone out there that I could speak to and get their counsel and really, hear from someone who had gone through this before, what it's like. And so I remember sitting down in my living room and taking out my computer and Googling male Jewish survivor of sexual abuse. And it was not a very fruitful Google search. Nothing came of it. And the results of my search were that no one else had done this before. No one else had come forward about it before. And that realization, that moment, it was very interesting. All at once, it was slightly demoralizing. It was saddening that I didn't have anyone to talk to, but it was extremely empowering, because I remember thinking to myself that, I certainly can't be the only person in the world who has gone through this and is going through this. And I know how much I would appreciate having the ability to speak to somebody. And what if instead of bemoaning my fate that there's no one for me to speak to, what if I could take the steps to be that person that others could reach out to, instead of just, throwing up my hands and saying, woe is me, what if I could make a difference in this area? And ultimately that was the decision that I made. And I went ahead with it, and, I did testify, and the story was published openly, very, very openly. And, it spread quite a bit. And Baruch Hashem, I'm in a place now where I have that ability to be there for others and speak about it publicly, and hopefully to be of help to others. And it's become a tremendous bracha.
Wow. How long did the whole legal process last for?
So there's between the police investigation was from January of 2018 until Erev Pesach, and then the end of March of 2018. Just getting my years straight. My abuser was arrested a few hours before the Seder, and then at that point it gets handed over to the courts, and it schlepped out from April of 2018 through, all the way till the very end, was just a few months ago, was just in March. She stood trial in November of last year. It was a 4-day jury trial. She was charged with 7 felonies, on which she was found guilty on all counts, and she was sentenced just recently in March of this year, March 12th of 2020. So all told, it was about a 2-year parsha, and it was definitely an experience.
And during those times, during that 2-year period, during the trial, you were in the courtroom together at the same time as she was. And I could only imagine what a dramatic type of experience that was for you.
Yeah, in our, actually, I say our country, and I don't mean that in to pick a fight. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in all seriousness, in our country, we afford people the right to confront their abuser in open court. And every citizen is afforded that right. And it was explained to me, we have a process, and everyone has rights. And my abuser, notwithstanding the evidence that had been accumulated against her, had those rights. And if I wanted to see this through, I was going to have to sit in a witness box and tell my story and have holes poked in it by a defense attorney and have every horrible insinuation and allegation made about me in open court while she sits there. And that's the cost of doing something like that. And it was something which I really felt strongly about. I felt that, this was something which I wanted to see through to the end. And I was fortunate to have the ability to do that. I know that there are, for every one of me, there's probably dozens who don't have the ability to ultimately get the justice they deserve. And I was passionate about it, and it was undoubtedly difficult, but Baruch Hashem, it ended up where it needed to end up.
I have a note here to tell us about the healing process, but I feel like before I ask you to talk about the healing process, if you can, maybe before healing comes an illness, or not I don't know, I have the wrong words. Like you suffered an emotional, healing comes after you suffer. Again, my words fail me, and I hadn't planned this particular question, but I think you understand what I'm asking you.
I do.
Tell us about the hurt. Tell us about the pain. Tell us about the brokenness, and then please tell us about the healing.
So it's actually very interesting that you began with remembering Arizona, and I think, Rabbi Moshe, if I'm correct, I think that was my first year in camp, which was 1999, which if memory serves, if it was that winter, it's kind of, if you think about it in a larger scale of things, it was a handful of months after the abuse had started. When I came forward about my story, the overwhelming response from so many people that had known me as a kid, as a yeshiva student, whilst it was really going on, was one of surprise. It was one of, for a lot of people, it was shocking. We never thought that you would have been sexually abused, which in a certain sense was very motivational to hear that. But I'll get to the motivational part in a moment, because that's more part of the healing. Everyone who suffers childhood trauma processes it differently. And everyone who goes through something like that, whether as a child or as an adult, makes a decision to handle their trauma in a different way. Sadly, people who process their trauma through negative behavior traits and through harmful behaviors are the ones that we know about. Typically we know about people who have undergone trauma because it's a footnote in their story after they've been arrested for a crime, or after they have lost their life to substance abuse or alcoholism, or they've chosen really negative ways to deal with their pain. Usually we hear as an afterthought, well, they were a survivor of childhood trauma. It's so sad. But that would justify why they made all of these life choices. And the reality is that people who have a lot of pain in their past deal with it in different ways. For me, my way of dealing with it was making sure that nobody found out about it. And so, in a certain sense, my I wouldn't say my addiction, but my where I put all my efforts was to give off this image of just everything is fine, everything is normal, everything is great. I'm a happy, cheerful, quote unquote normal child, and don't let anybody know that this was going on, because this was a secret that I needed to protect so intensely. That's a painful experience. It's a painful experience to bury the truth and all of this trauma under layers of everything is fine, don't worry about me. But that's how I coped. That was my coping mechanism. That was my defense mechanism. And that went on for a number of years. And I continued through my yeshiva years. I continued into the early part of my marriage. And once I became a father, and the reality is that if we take issues like these and we bury them, and we hope never to give them attention by actively thinking about how much we're not going to think about them, they don't just go away. They don't just disappear in a puff of smoke. They take up residence, and they stake their claim to their residence that they take up within you, and they demand answers. And ultimately, my baggage demanded answers, and I'm thankful I got those answers. I was able to address those problems through therapy and through a number of healing processes. But it was a dark time. I had a conversation with a fellow survivor today, and we were reminiscing the idea that it's been, often said and well documented that sexual abuse is the loneliest experience in the world. And it really is, from a young age, to live with that sort of secrecy and live in a world where, you feel that you cannot let anybody else in is a painful process, for lack of a better term. And what I would add, go ahead. Sorry.
You use the word lonely.
It really is, and it's it's an experience of isolation. And what I would add, what I think a lot of people don't realize, is that that pain is not something which goes away after a set amount of therapy visits. I'll never forget when I first went to see a therapist. I wasn't overly excited about the idea, but I went, and he was the first human being I ever told that I thought I had been sexually abused. And we had a very productive talk for an hour. It was I guess pleasantly surprising for me. And at the end of the hour, I looked at him and I said, okay, this was, I had started by telling him how not excited I was to be there. And at the end of the hour, I said to him, I said, this was very productive and very helpful. Thank you. How many more times do you want to see me? When can I punch out? Nowadays, God forbid, someone gets an injury of some sort, they get a sickness, they go to a doctor, the doctor prescribes them some medication and they do some physical therapy and says, come back in 6 weeks for a follow-up. And then, God bless you, we don't expect to have long-term relationships with our doctors. We want to see them once, twice, a handful of times, and then, shukayach, you've put me back together again, and it's all good. And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he says, why don't you come back next week and we'll take it from there? And it was a deep acceptance that I needed to go through, that this is not an illness which you really heal from. This is not something which you'll take some medication and you'll take some pills, you'll go see a therapist, and you will be all better. It really doesn't work like that. It's a lifetime journey of healing. It's scars that don't really go away. But there's hope. And there's help, and there are, there's a way to go through it. There's numerous ways to go through it, and there's definitely hope and promise and ways to go about it out there. And I'm deeply thankful to God for the different paths that He's allowed me to find and to walk on, and to see His hand guiding me. And Baruch Hashem, there is a healing process, and there are steps that can be taken and must be taken and are taken, and you get through it one day at a time.
I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about the healing process, but before that, somebody sent me a question, and others, I want to encourage you, you can forward questions, and the way that you can do that is by going on to the group chat of this Zoom, and I will get the question. So I'll try to cover some of the questions, or as many as I can. But this was a question that I wanted to ask you as well. You talked about the loneliness, and one of the most difficult parts of just keeping this secret. So to be clear, until you met with the therapist, did absolutely nobody, like your family, parents, siblings, did nobody know about this this abuse? And what about your wife? When did she find out about this?
Not a single living soul. And that was a very intentional choice. Before I went to see my therapist, I would have given anything that I had in this world. I would have, gone through any effort possible to keep that a secret. I think a large part of the conversation, just to provide the context needed, is I would say that until I really started the therapy, I didn't have the right vocabulary to properly understand what had happened to me. And for the most part, I believe that my experience had been my fault. I really lacked the appropriate understanding of what, just from a very basic level, what defines sexual abuse. I was familiar with the term from a very young age. I read the paper. I knew what, I'd come across the words. And in my mind, the definition of sexual abuse required coercion. So it required there to be painful resistance and screaming and shouting. And it had to be, painful and torturous in a certain sense. And it really required all of those important components in my mind. And as far as I was concerned, you couldn't be sexually abused at the hands of someone who cared for you. You couldn't be sexually abused at the hands of someone who was paid to love you and to be there and to care for your family, as my abuser was. And so as a result of that, because I believed that it was my fault and all the guilt and the shame that was associated with it, I made every possible living effort to make sure that no one was to find out about it, because in my mind, finding out about it would be my fault. And about my wife didn't know about it. My wife did not find out about it when we were first married. After my wife had noticed repeated behavior trends that were very troubling, and I was suffering from anxiety and depression and all of those host of mood swings until I went to therapy. And having that conversation with her was extremely difficult, and having that conversation with my parents was extremely difficult, and having that conversation with my siblings was extremely difficult, and so on and so on. But I think it's important to answer that question very specifically. Not a single person knew about it, and that was exactly how I had wanted it, and how I had expended every effort possible to make sure that would remain the case.
So you mentioned the loneliness, and you mentioned another strong word, which is shame. You felt guilty. You felt shame, as if somehow this terrible thing which happened to you was somehow your fault. How do you heal from that? Or how did you get past this crazy idea that a terrible thing inflicted upon you is your fault? And how do you move on and heal from that?
It's a heavy question. Well, on its most basic level, I got an education. It was clarified to me that was not the case. This is textbook child abuse. This is an adult manipulating and taking advantage of a child. This is a crime, and this is everything which is wrong, and that was made very, very clear to me. But in terms of the wider emotional healing, I would say those are probably the deepest scars that stay behind, especially when you live a life where you convince yourself of a certain reality for such a long time, and you live your life based on those realities for such a long time. That healing process is continuous, and that healing process is something which always needs to be dealt with. And I think that for most survivors of sexual abuse, those are absolutely the scars that are left behind. And I think that healing from shame and guilt is I know personally for me, my faith and my belief in God and played a very strong role in being able to come back from that. But at the end of the day, pain and shame and guilt are learned character traits, and like most character traits, they take as much time to undo as they took to do. And I think it's something which a lot of survivors need to be honest with themselves, that it is a constant battle. It's a constant journey, and it's something which we engage with regularly. I was speaking to a community a few days ago, and somebody asked such a powerful question, which I thought the question was great, but I thought that the ability to give the answer honestly was an important opportunity. Someone said, how do you get through the difficult days? Even today, you still have difficult days. How do you get through those difficult days? And I answered them, in all honesty, you acknowledge that you're having a difficult day. Part of getting through something like that is being fair to yourself, and acknowledging that, today you went through this episode. It brought up these feelings. It brought up, this stuff that sticks within you that you're actively trying to get rid of. Today is going to be a difficult day. Tomorrow is going to be a much, much better day. Undoubtedly, tomorrow, you'll wake up and you'll feel better and you'll be able to deal with the tasks at hand. But today is going to be a difficult day, and there's no shame in saying that, and there's no harm in saying that, and there's no issue with acknowledging that and giving yourself that, and allowing yourself that space to heal and to deal with things. That's all part of the process.
Absolutely. What motivated you to decide to give up on your secret, which you'd had held on to for so long, and get help? What's that turning point where you said, I got to do something about this?
In my particular scenario, my wife and my parents played a very, very strong role in it. It's interesting as I look back on it now. I feel almost inadequate to give people advice as to how do they know it's a good time to go deal with their issues when I resisted that temptation for such a long time, and I fought it so passionately. But I think that and as I look back on it now, a person who commits to spending a large portion of their time thinking about not thinking about something needs to acknowledge that this is something which needs to be dealt with a force larger than themselves. Spending day after day after day having all of these problems crop up in your life, and using so much emotional energy to think about I'm not going to think about this now. It does lead you to a point where you really need to realize that there's something you need more than the tools that you have. You really need to find someone that can give you the ability to process. And I know that for myself, there was a defense mechanism that I had always built up, that no one would understand my particular set of circumstances. I live in Salt Lake City. I'm Chabad. I was abused as a boy by a woman. My case is 1 in a million, and no one would be able to give me that that help that I need. And that's not true. I found someone who was able to provide that. And I would say to most people who are going through that conundrum of I should speak to someone, but there's probably no one out there that can help me. That's probably not true. There's definitely someone out there who has been through what you've been through, who does have the help at hand to provide it to you, and all it takes is just the desire to look for it.
Mm-hmm. As a fellow Chabad, as a fellow Chassid who subscribes to the idea that everything that happens comes from Hashem, how do you square that when you're thinking about your own life? The idea that everything is ordained from above, nothing happens without Hashem's attention and involvement. I can't imagine that you've never asked yourself, why would a loving God allow what happened to you to happen to you?
So that's an extremely powerful question. The reality is, and it's I think a lot of times people hearing this from a Chabad rabbi, from a shliach, might be surprised at the honesty of it. But I think it's pretty accurate to say that God and I have had a pretty complicated relationship over the years. As I look back at it, and I mean that in all honesty. I think back to the beginning, to most of my life, to the early, the first 20 odd years of my life, and I was pretty convinced, rather seriously, that God hated me on a very, very, simple and basic level. I mean, assuming that I was under the impression that everything that had gone on was at least half my fault, and I had put myself in a situation where all this was going on, and I was definitely at least partially to blame for it. And I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that what was going on was unequivocally wrong and against halacha, against moral society, and wrong on any and every level. That doesn't leave me in a very good situation. And I really deeply believe that, and it sounds almost childish, but it started as a thought in my childhood and really progressed as I grew up, that God hated me. In the grand scheme of things, I was not a very good person. I was engaged in some serious moral failings. And that's a lonely feeling, and that's obviously, difficult to go through, the very formative years of your life thinking that, God is looking for an opportunity for you to be run over by a car because that's how much you matter in the grand scheme of things. And that's really where you're placed in the divine perspective of the world. Sadly, what I realized is that the only thing which is more challenging than that attitude is what came after it. Once I started therapy and I was ready to accept, or at least to hear that these actions were not my fault. I was not to blame. I was taken advantage of. I was abused. And these were not things that I had engaged in willingly. This was not on my part. That meant that I had been abused, which meant that an adult had done these things to me, and God had sat by and watched. And that was difficult. That was more difficult than God hating me. It was more difficult than that was the need to process what kind of loving God, and especially as we learn about God and through the lens of Chassidus and God's being a loving father and being someone who only seeks good for us. What kind of loving God allows children to be abused? In what universe does that happen? In what universe does any sort of supernal being allow that to go on? What does God seek to gain from this? What's the end game here? And that was something which I struggled with for a very long time, even in my position as a shliach, even in my position as a rabbi, and being someone who espouses faith and encourages people to strengthen their connection with God. I had my own fair share of questions. And ultimately, what I had the ability to recognize, and I think what really gave me that sort of push to go forward, and what really helps me on those dark days, is the ability to see something good come of it. And if I can live in a world where I can see myself as a vessel to carry out what God wants in this world, and to be His messenger to affect change in an area where I have that opportunity, that's what needs to come of this. That's why this happened on a certain level. Why does that need to happen in a way that that leaves behind so much scarring? That we'll never know. And that's part of our experience as being ma'aminim, as being believers, is having that blind faith even in challenging times. But on the contrary, I think I've come to a place which I'm tremendously grateful for, where I have the ability to see what might have been intended to come from this whole story, to see some positivity, to see some healing, to see some good that's been affected in this world as a result of the story. That is a tremendous, tremendous gift from on high that I am thankful for on a regular basis.
Wow. If you could talk to the 8-year-old you who was being the 8-year-old you who was being abused, what would you tell him?
So we speak quite regularly. My 8-year-old, and honestly, it's a large portion of therapy is reconnecting with that child who's been harmed. But I think that ultimately, what I try to remind myself and remind that 8-year-old self, and I speak to survivors about this on a regular basis, is to remind that child that I will continue to have their back, and I will continue to fight for them, and I will continue to give them the support that they didn't have so many years ago. And a large part of the therapy process is to almost differentiate yourself from that child and put that child in a little bit of a corner and create that distance. But it's been helpful. It's been helpful to remind that child and to almost have someone to fight for on a daily basis. It definitely motivates you more to engage in difficult work when you can dedicate that to someone, you can do it for somebody. And so I would, if I had the opportunity to meet that 8-year-old, I would definitely tell him that I'm trying every single day to right the wrongs that were done to him, and to give him the healing that he needs.
Wow. If we could talk for some of the technical things for a second, how did you, if you are comfortable talking about how you accumulated enough evidence, and what was the penalty of your abuser?
So it's a pretty well documented story. I don't mind to share it. When I had gone to the police initially, I had a long talk with the detective, and I kind of poured out my whole life to him at that point. And at the end of the conversation, he said to me, that, I believe you, I hear you, I think you're very brave for coming forward. To be brutally honest with you, there's no forensic evidence at that point. There's no eyewitness testimony. There's no one else that saw these acts. There's no smoking gun. There's no, piece of clothing that's soaked in someone's blood. So this is going to be difficult. At the very least, I can promise you that we're going to go down and have a conversation with your abuser and bring up these allegations to her. But there's not a whole lot to go on here. And I said, okay. And he called me back a few weeks later, and he told me that in cases like mine, it's very common, if possible, to set up a recorded phone call, what they call in that line of work a pretextual phone call between the victim and their abuser, and to try and get the suspect to at least implicate themselves in the crime. Would I be willing to do that? And I said yes. I went down to SLCPD on Yud Aleph Nissan on the Rebbe's birthday, and they set up a recorded line, and I spoke to my abuser for about 40 minutes without her knowing that I was sitting in the police department on a recorded line, and she implicated herself in everything that I had told the police. She was arrested 3 days later on 131 counts of sexual abuse. Ultimately, she was charged by a prosecutor here with 7 felonies. And as I mentioned earlier, she was found guilty by a jury. And Utah, we have something called indeterminate sentencing, where a judge does not assign a final number to a guilty party. You don't stand in front of a judge and they tell you you're going to go to jail for X amount of days. It's between point A and point B. And the sum total of all of her guilty counts, she's in jail from anywhere between 25 years to life. So that's the technical part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is true, but perhaps it is. Are there, in your darkest and most challenging moments, is there something from what we study in Torah, something from what we study in Hasidus, something from the Rebbe's teachings, or any particular kind of notions or ideas from what we learn that are particularly encouraging or helpful to you when you are struggling?
So there's definitely an idea. I shared the story a few days ago. It came to me as many inspiring ideas from Chassidus. It came to me from a very, very interesting source. But I think the message that I saw in this very interesting encounter, carried within it a lot of depth. In the middle of all this, several years ago, I was out shopping one day. I was in a home goods store, and I knocked over, as I was walking through an aisle, I knocked over a vase of sorts that was on a shelf, and it fell, and it made a very loud noise, and it broke into several hundred pieces, and I felt terrible, and I'm trying to clean up the mess. And this store employee was walking by, and she just kind of, poked her head into the aisle and saw the mess on the floor, and she says to me, "Sir, you break it, you bought it." And I'm like, okay.
That must have made you feel much better.
I'll say, you could have offered me a broom, but okay, I will I'll take the sticker to the cashier, and I'll pay full price for it. And I remember a day or two later, I was having a particularly rough day, and I remember reflecting on that story, and I turned to God and I said, God Almighty, you break it, you bought it. In Chassidus, it's reinforced how every single moment of creation is another divine energy to recreate the world, the entire world, every existence, every second. And clearly, you have a plan for all this. If all you wanted me to do was suffer and just suffer without end and without justification, you need not go through recreating me now every day through the dark days and having put me through this whole thing. You could have just stopped. You could have just let me go. You don't need to we talk about in Chassidus that if God wants to strip away an existence, he doesn't even need to use the energy to take something away. All he does is stop creating it. And I remember turning to the Almighty in that moment and saying to him, you break it, you bought it, you put me through this. There's got to be something that you seek to accomplish here. There's got to be something for which you're continuing to use out all this energy. And so all I ask you is to just give me the ability to see that manifest itself. Let me know what you hope to gain with all this. Let me know what you hope to accomplish through all this, because I don't see that at this moment. I don't know what was the purpose in all this. All I hope is that one day you'll buy the item that you broke, and you'll show me really what you hope to achieve through all this, and provide some sort of justification. And I'd like to believe that I've seen that. I'd like to believe that the good that's been able to come out as a result of that story has definitely given me that perspective.
A couple of questions just from, I think, from a loving mother that a mom sent over. Having children yourself, are you hesitant to have a nanny at your home taking care of your children? And kind of together with that, your nanny was fired after 10 years of abuse. Did she end up being a nanny to another family? Do you know if she abused anyone else?
So I'll start with the second one. No one else has come forward, to report abuse at the hands of my abuser. She did, in addition to my family, she did sit for 2 other families in town. And from what I understand, after she left town, she sat for numerous families, and no one else has come forward. As I tell people, you can have 100 different child psychology experts who will tell you that a perpetrator latching on to one child is very common, and another 100 who will tell you that it's very uncommon. And, everyone is welcome to follow their own expert opinion, whether that is classic predatory behavior or not, but that is my life experience. But I like the question about the nanny. I'll share 2 brief episodes. Before I went public with the story, I had started telling extended family, siblings, cousins, people that I was closer with. And so there was one cousin in particular that I told the story to, and I shared with him over phone. And he was very, very, shook up. You can hear on the other end of the line by the story. And he hung up the phone, and he calls me back like 15 minutes later and says, "I just want you to know, I told my wife what you told me, and we were both so horrified about what you had gone through. We have a number of different babysitters taking care of our kids, and we called all of them and just fired them sight on scene. Just got rid of every single person entrusted with our kids' childcare, just because we were so bothered by your story." So I thanked him for the kind intention and the sweet gesture involved, in his loyalty of sorts. But I shared with him, I have nannies in my home, numerous. And thank God we just opened a preschool, which was closed for a while with COVID. But until that point, we had numerous employees in my home, and I genuinely feel, and this comes up very often when I speak to parents, and people will ask, and a number of people called in the immediate aftermath of my story coming out, and they all asked, what can we do to guarantee that this will not happen to our children? And I said to a number of parents, and I don't think they were very happy to hear it, I said, the only thing you can do to guarantee this will not happen to your child is to wrap them in bubble wrap and lock them in a closet in your home. That is the only way to guarantee that your child will never come across a predator. Short of that, there's nothing you can do to guarantee that. I mean, I think enough history and enough data shows that child predators are manifest in every way, shape, and form, and have any sort of profession, and they literally, they get access to kids however they do. And there's nothing that we can do as parents to absolutely make sure our child will never cross paths with the predator. What we can do and what we must do is provide a place for our children to feel like they have the safety to speak to us as parents about any topic in the world without fear of being judged or of being shamed or of ever feeling like they were to be blamed for any given situation. And I often share with people, going back to the camp idea, I would spend literally, 2 months and a week with other kids a year. I'd go to summer camp and to winter camp in Arizona. And that was the exposure that I had to the outside world, to other frum kids, to other Jewish kids, to other kids in general. And every year before I would go
I'm sorry, you did not attend school in Utah. You were homeschooled. Right. Your only exposure to other kids was a couple months here.
And furthermore, it wasn't like online school like Chabad has now, where you're in a virtual classroom, with kids from all over the world. It was just me and my brothers. So we'd go to camp, for 2 months a year in the summer and for a week in the winter. And on the way to camp every summer, my parents would take me to the airport, and in the car we would have, the very basic conversation. My parents were very good about it. And they would say to my siblings and I, listen, when you're in camp, if an adult harms you, if an adult hurts you physically, in any way and threatens you as a result of that, you need not be afraid of any adult that you might come in contact with in camp. The next day, you call home and you call your mommy and tati, and your tati is stronger than any adult that you'll come across in camp, and they will come to camp and they will, punch your counselor in the face or whoever it is, and they will protect you. So you do not need to be afraid of anybody in camp. So as a child, if I go to camp with that information and I'm in camp, and one night my counselor takes me outside the bunkhouse onto the porch and slaps me across the face and says, you better not tell anybody that I just did that. Because if you tell someone that I slapped you across the face, I will do it to you again and again and again. So you really better keep your mouth shut. When I go back into the bunkhouse, I know exactly what to do. I was coached about this episode. I'm going to call my father the next day and tell him that this counselor hit me and he threatened me, and I'm not afraid of him because my parents told me not to be afraid of him. And so my father's going to come here and take care of my counselor and protect me. But what would have happened if my counselor would have taken me onto the porch one night and slipped me $100 bill? Would have just given me $100 and said, this is yours and you can keep it so long as you don't tell anybody about this exchange. It's $100, a lot of money for a little boy. You can keep this $100. You can do with it what you want. It's your money, and you can hold on to it so long as you don't tell anybody that I have given it to you. And if you keep this quiet for a week, I will give you another $100 bill at the end of the week. But you know the terms of our deal. So long as you're quiet, you get to keep this money. At that point, I'm not keeping somebody else's secret out of fear or trepidation. I'm keeping my own secret, because I have a very invested interest in the story staying quiet, because I stand to benefit from it. I want to hold on to those $100. So now the person that I'm protecting in this whole scheme of things is not the counselor, it's me. My secrecy is keeping myself quiet because it's my secret now, because it's my benefit. And so I think looking back on my childhood, I never said anything because of how I had perceived the situation. I was keeping my abuser secret. Or my stories, what we can share with them and empower them is that they can always and must always feel absolutely comfortable to share with us as their parents anything. There's never a topic that they should ever feel is necessary to keep secret from us. And on the contrary, the more they might feel that something should be a secret from their parents, that should be the greatest sign for them in the world that they should speak to somebody about it.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Can you talk to us a little bit about your work in Salt Lake City, and how what you've experienced as a child impacts your work?
So my wife and I moved here. We were tasked with being here for the younger demographic of the community, which it lends itself to a number of different ages. As it happens, we've made most of our efforts now in the area of young professionals. Baruch Hashem, Salt Lake City has a very flourishing economy and a job growth market, and so we've got a number of people who, young people, graduate students, young families, first jobs, who are moving out here and starting their professional lives, and we try to provide for them. And Baruch Hashem, we've seen tremendous success in that, and we're very fortunate for that. I would say that my experiences have definitely, I think, have given me a lot of valuable tools, I would say, as a Chabad rabbi. Number one, it's reminded me that you